Hey guys, Akio Murasaki here. Continuing a little bit on the localization streak, some more localization news. This time we have an article from Anime Corner talking about the recent kind of change of stance, I would say, from Kadokawa's CEO, who is emphasizing a Japan-first approach to stories and storytelling. From his own words, you can create unique works by not marketing with the mindset of let's make a manga that will sell globally. Globalization has been a major theme in a lot of works of fiction recently, specifically when it comes to video games. We've seen the West trying to embrace like a very kind of, some people call this global homologous, but like a more global first approach, what in the end doesn't really work because you're trying to appeal to a lot of completely different audiences and you end up appealing to no one. And anime and manga has kind of, I guess, found itself in a similar position in the recent years, primarily through the lens of localization. So even though a lot of the original works were created with like Japanese audiences in mind, they were being marketed and they were being localized in a way that would specifically appeal to Western audiences and even more specifically to American audiences. So we're talking here about like deculturalization, changes in slang, changes in verbiage sometimes, changes in the personalities of characters, how they're being portrayed, and then making the final product, making the anime or manga appeal to Western audiences. And so here we have an interview with the Kadokawa CEO, specifically for Nikkei. If you don't know, Nikkei is a kind of like a more serious newspaper, I would say. So we have here the president Takeshi Natsuno, an interview with him about the overseas expansion and the global potential of Japanese content. And so he was talking about the diversity in storytelling, which even by global standards, which is very much a thing in Japan. If you just look at kind of like how much is being pumped into the market and then kind of the tip of the iceberg that eventually gets published, we still, like, this is basically the best of the best in terms of stories. And because there aren't so many constraints, I would say, as is the case with the Western market, you do get naturally a lot more variety in the stories, a lot more diversity. And here I'm talking about kind of like the more Western diversity, what is called like quote unquote diversity, so more like DEI stuff. Stories like this also naturally get published, but you also have just kind of regular stories like the old school anime and manga stories that very often appear in Japan. In the West, you would see a more more directed approach, I should say. So basically he says here also, if you create content that sells in Japan, it will sell overseas, which has been kind of the motto since the very beginning, since Japanese content was localized and localized for the Western market. However, there's been a shift recently where there's been more appeal towards global markets as part of the localization process. You can create unique works by not marketing with the mindset of let's make a manga that will sell globally. Now, this is a very important angle because it kind of then enters the initial creation process. And I think this is a little more obvious when it comes to video games, where you will see stories being written, directed, characters being constructed in a way that instantly would appeal to the global market. I think this is a little less with manga anime, but it seems to have also been a direction in manga and anime. It's necessary to create a wide variety of intellectual property without compromising on quality, which would be the case if you wanted to try to appeal to everyone at the same time. And his words follow those of Evangelion's Hideaki Anno, who also stated that it's overseas fans who should adapt to Japanese works, not Japanese works appealing explicitly from the beginning as part of its creation process to Western fans. So we do see this strong shift, I would say very, very recently, like the end of the last year or so, or the last couple of months. That has not been the case before, as I mentioned. But it's an interesting and, from my perspective, a very welcome shift. And he also points out here that the Japanese perception of what is liked overseas likely differs from what is actually popular overseas. Japan should stick to what it knows. Yes, this is also very, very true. And he also kind of points out is that being too cautious of global appeal may lead to failure, and inadvertently it would. Because the way it's done in the West is that anime and manga for localization are trying to appeal to so-called normie audiences, to people who don't necessarily would watch anime, wouldn't read manga, unless being motivated for jumping for these like extra cultural hoops. And that has kind of failed because these people are still going to find a reason why not to like a specific anime and consider it problematic. And by doing so, you're also alienating the core weeb fandom when localizing stories. There's also some information that kind of like lets know, despite this comment, Kadokawa Chief Anime Officer Daijo Kudo said that in August 2025, the company also needed to produce anime with themes also liked by Western audiences. That has been the direction before, and now we have a bit of a shift in direction. As you can see here, that was done in August 2025, and a lot of these discussions about kind of going back to appealing more to the Japanese side of fandoms, to Japanese culture in anime. This is kind of more like end of last year, really. And I do, as I said, I do welcome this a lot. I think maintaining the Japanese nature of Japanese entertainment is super critical to, of course, making it unique, not making it, homogenized and globalized like literally everything in the West. But it's also important to maintain the audience that has been interacting with this from the very, very beginning, because it's this audience. This is something, I'm just gonna small tangent here, but it's equally important. This is the audience who eventually promotes for free, absolutely for free, who via the activities of fandoms promotes the product. Not the audience you are trying to court, the ones that might come in, but the audience that already exists. And this is a massive failure of Western entertainment, especially when it comes to video games in the last, 10 years, 15 years, where for every series they're trying to court a new audience, alienate the previous audience, and the previous audience now starts generating bad rap for the series or bad rap for the product, which then obviously also discourages the incoming audience from buying the product, and you end up with far less profit. So while trying to broaden audiences, this is something that's being very often missed in the West, but since Japanese approaches are very often way more conservative, it does make sense to kind of go back to the status quo that existed before and to try to maintain it. However, as one user points out here, I found it very interesting. One user points out here on Twitter is that there are actually multiple reasons why the Kadokawa CEO might have said this, and they have partially something to do with just maintaining the kind of cultural aspect, the Japanese aspect of Japanese works, but also has to do with a failure to appeal to global audiences. So there's like tangible issues that specifically here talking about ReZero has suffered from in the West. So there are multiple issues. So the IP, as Dugna here mentions, the IP has been handled horribly in the West. YenPress, responsible for the translations of the light novel and the manga, has done them very poorly. I might also just jump straight into this here. Here's a website that I'm going to discuss in a separate video since it goes into details of how translations are done. But basically, it archives and lists all of the bad translations that were done for the light novels of ReZero. And as you can see here, there are issues that are kind of marked as low severity, so kind of like annoying, but not necessarily, completely breaking the understanding of the story. But they do add up. Some of them are marked low, but they do end up being very significant. Quite a lot of them are also marked with medium, and there are quite some, I already unpacked a couple of them. There are quite some here which are marked with high, where there's been like critical changes to the perception of the story, to the core of the story, to the details, which then obviously are going to affect how you see the story in the West. Yeah, by going back to the post here, Crunchyroll, Of course, Crunchyroll is involved here as the monopolist on anime in the West, sadly. So the IP has been handled horribly. We had leaks, we had global leaks, and this is one of the things that should absolutely never happen whatsoever, which is streaming season 3 and season 4 before Japan is able to do this. This should absolutely never happen. And thus angering the only base that actually bought the novels, again here referring to the core audience that I mentioned before, and also the Japanese themselves, right? So we are talking about here, he mentions the Japanese themselves, but I'm also talking about here people who would normally interact with kind of like the, what's it called? The Japanese version of both the anime and the light novels and the manga. So the core audience. Hell, they even had to create brand new ReZero accounts to handle marketing, some not involving Crunchyroll. Yeah, this is a massive pure F up, honestly. It looks pretty bad for them. And there's some other stuff which I don't want to spend too much time going on here. But there is something to be said here. Now to address likely why Kadokawa CEO is actually saying this, China has blockaded Japanese media heavily from China itself. So this is something that has been the current relationship between China and Japan is very strained at the moment, and this does actually affect a lot of the even cultural products like anime, manga, and video games. Even gacha games, even Chinese gacha games in some cases do cut out Japanese themed events which were the norm in the past. They do cut them out nowadays, not to get into like legal trouble, not to get into PR trouble with the Chinese side of the fandom. Yeah, that's actually happening. But also, one thing to point out here, a good chunk of modern censorship in all media globally, because Chinese markets are lucrative. And I thought about this for a couple of minutes, and I can actually see this really being the case, because we're seeing a lot of censorship in the West, and we're thinking, okay, it must be coming from the more progressive side, from the publishers, for all of these pro-regulation institutions, from Visa, from MasterCard, from Steam very often. Clearly, these must be hard regulations that come into place. Also publishers in the West that have these regulations that restrict how Japanese content is brought to the West. And I thought to myself, okay, well, normally that's where I thought the problem is. But apparently the extra issue is the Chinese market. And that makes sense, because when you think about the global market being literally everything else, it is so much easier to just have these regulations which apply to every single non-Japanese country. Rather than kind of splitting hairs here and trying to have different regulations and paying attention to what is and is not allowed in individual countries, let's say in Europe, for instance. So they go for kind of like the lowest common denominator and just basically sanitize and censor the content, knowing that one of the more lucrative, one of the bigger markets is in the end going to be China. And this is also the case for movies. There's been quite some talks, I think last year, around bigger movie titles where extra censorship was done for the Chinese market. Yes. And this was kind of like on top of required censorship. That was one of the more important one and one of the more highlighted one. So the Chinese market, and I think also Saudi Arabia as the other one being fairly lucrative here. So this is how I see it. And this makes, as I said, makes total sense. And because now the relationship between China and Japan is very, very strained, Japan now has the full freedom of actually returning to its core audience, returning to having their products be more Japanese as they used to be in the past. But it is it for now for these news. In one of the further videos, I'm going to go for some of the mistranslations and localizations when it comes to ReZero, because I think they're very, very fascinating. It's definitely worth going for them. But for this video, that is all. If you like my content, like and subscribe, and I see you guys in the next one. Mata ne!